Hey everyone, and welcome as we continue our study looking through the book of Acts, looking at the New Testament church and the formation right now of the Testament church and how it was formed and kind of what it looked like in the early beginnings. And today we're going to look at a kind of a more serious part of some of the things, not a happy part, I would put it that for sure, of the establishment of the early church and what some of the things that happened and where the devil started to try to come in and look at that. And so today we're looking at Ananias and Sapphira, and this is from Acts 5, verses 1 through 11. I'm going to read this one. It's a little bit longer. I don't like to read sometimes when it's a little bit longer, but I think this one's an important one and something we really need to focus on, especially us as Christians. And if you're a leader in the church, especially this. This isn't talking about the leadership, but I do think this is something we need to look at. And so Acts 5, verses 1 through 11 says, "But there was a certain man named Ananias who, with his wife Sapphira, sold some property. He brought part of the money to the apostles, claiming it was the full amount." That's the key word in there, claiming it was the full amount. With his wife's consent, he kept the rest. Then Peter said, "Ananias, why have you let Satan fill your heart? You lied to the Holy Spirit and you kept some of the money for yourself. The property was yours to sell or not to sell as you wished. And after selling it, the money was also yours to give away. How could you do a thing like this? You weren't lying to us, but lying to God." And as soon as Ananias heard these words, he fell to the floor and died. Everyone who heard about it was terrified. Then some young men got up, wrapped him in a sheet, and took him out and buried him. About 3 hours later, his wife came in, not knowing what had happened. Peter asked her, "What was the price you and your husband received for your land?" Or was this the price you and your husband received for your land? "Yes," she replied, "that was the price." And Peter said, "How could the two of you even think of conspiring to test the Holy Spirit or the Spirit of the Lord like this? The young men who buried your husband are just outside the door, and they will carry you out too." Instantly she fell to the floor and died. When the young men came in and saw that she was dead, they carried her out and buried her beside her husband. Great fear gripped the entire church and everyone else who heard what had happened, which I would imagine so. And so what we see starting in Acts 5, really Acts 5 through 8, which we'll see next week, we'll hit a lot of it next week, is we start to see an internal and external problems facing the early church, right? So, what we've seen so far is kind of the happy side of it, right? It's the church is growing, people are coming to Christ. There's been a little bit of persecution, a little bit of, you need to stop doing this, but nothing really major yet, right? But now we're starting to see in Acts 5, we're going to start to see the internal things that we see, and we're going to see this with greed and dishonesty, and then we're going to see some administrative headaches as we go a little bit further. Which is anytime something's growing, right? There's growing pains, so there's issues you run into, and so sometimes that's a good sign that you're having those, and you just got to work them out. But these are this particular situation was not, it was something that had needed to be worked out and hit immediately, because they were in, it's one of those things, like I've seen this before. Like if a church is really taking off and they're doing well, you don't want to let something that's really toxic and that's going to destroy it come in, and this type of behavior and this type of attitude would have. And so this is why we're going to see why God took such a harsh stance here. And so, while the church leaders here, they were careful and sensitive in dealing with their internal problems. We're going to see that here. I don't know. I wouldn't say they were very sensitive. They were straight to the point with this one. And so they the main thing for them was, through all of this, was that they kept their focus on what was most important, and that is spreading the gospel of Christ. And they wanted to get rid of anything that would hinder them from spreading the gospel of Christ. And so, the thing we see here is, even after the Holy Spirit had come around, believers weren't immune to the temptations of Satan. One of them being greed, which we see here, and so, even though we have the Holy Spirit, even though we're Christians, we're still going to mess up. We're still going to sin. We're still going to have those temptations. And even though Christ defeated Satan on the cross, right, he's still actively trying to get us to stumble. And he does that today. I mean, I think every one of us who's a Christian, we know that. We see the things that he comes after us with, and tempts us with, and goes after us with. And so the thing that we see here, is Ananias and Sapphira, they fell into that temptation, right? And so the sin here for them was not, or the sin that they committed here was stinginess and holding back part. I'm sorry. Let me put this. it was the sin that they had here was not stinginess, was not holding back part of the money. There was nothing wrong with doing that. They sold the field. And if they wanted to just give half of it to God, then that would have been perfectly fine. That was their choice. That they could have done that. It was whether they wanted to sell the land, how much to give. That was up to them, right? There's really no command. To say how much you have to give. Now I know a lot of people, use the Old Testament measure of 10%, right, to tithe and all that stuff, but there's really nothing in the New Testament besides Christ, us being told to give according to how we've been blessed, right? And that's the measure for giving. And so there's no stringent rule around this, and then they weren't bound to anything. The sin here was that they were lying to God, and they were lying to God's people, saying, "Hey, yeah, we sold this field for this much. We're giving you the full amount of what we sold it for," and then actually holding some of it back from themselves. And so they were deceiving God, trying to deceive God, right? They're deceiving God's people, and they were deceiving, trying to make it look like they were more generous than they actually were, and so that's the part, right? And so this act was judged harshly because dishonesty and greed and covetousness are destructive, very, very destructive, in a church. And it prevents the Holy Spirit from working effectively. And so they had to, early on, they had to get a hold of this and be like, okay, we have to stop this immediately. This wasn't Peter deciding, hey, we're going to do this. This wasn't, this doing this. It was the Holy Spirit, the God, was saying, hey, we're going to stop this now before this infiltrates the church and destroys the church. And I've seen this. I've seen, this type of dishonesty and greed and covetousness and those type of things, whether it's money or power or that kind of stuff, destroy churches. Because especially with leadership, right? If you have a leadership this way, then that's going to spread down into the people, and the people are going to see that, and it's not going to be good for the church. And so, obviously, all lying is bad. We should not lie. We're told not to lie. But when we lie to try to deceive God and His people about our relationship with Him, we destroy our testimony for Christ. We destroy, and I've seen this. I know people who, it's like, you talk to them about a certain person, or you mention someone, knowing someone, and they're like, oh yeah, I know that person, and he's a what, or she's a what, and it's like, what do you mean? It's like, oh yeah, blah blah blah, and it's like all this, and so that ruins the reputation of the church, and so it ruins our testimony for Christ, and so it's extremely harmful to have this type of stuff going on and people in the outside world seeing it. And so this is why God took this so seriously with starting out the church. He wasn't going to allow this to start and to permeate the church when it was first building up, and have something that could come in and really destroy it. And so I'm glad He doesn't do it this way with every time, especially now. Unfortunately, I think it would be, you have a lot of people dropping dead because we're not perfect and we mess up a lot, and so it's a good thing. But this was a special circumstance. This was, the reason that this was done was because, hey, we need to make sure that we start this out right, and we don't allow these type of things to come in. Don't be lying, don't be deceiving, don't be trying to destroy the church. And so people will read this and be like, all right, they'll read this about them being struck down, like, man, God is being really harsh here. It's like, I thought God was, supposed to be this God of love and forgiveness and all that stuff. And He's like, I thought, some people be like, I thought all the wrath stuff was in the Old Testament. And we like to emphasize that grace and mercy side of God, but I mean, and for good reason, because God is very graceful. He is very merciful, but it's easy to overlook a lot of times how equally important the truth of God's holiness is, right? We must remember that God hadn't changed, and He still hates sin as much as He ever did. And so, we've got to remember that. Yes, God still, He has shows us a ton of grace, shows us a ton of mercy, but there's still going to be times where He's going to have to act. And this was one of those times. And so it produced this shock, right? His judgment on them produced this shock and fear among the believers, making them realize how serious God was regarding the sin in the church. And so we need to have that same attitude. We cannot sit by as Christians and let people willfully sin in the church, whether it's a small, what we would call a white lie, right? White lies can destroy a church. Lies about something and people and other stuff can destroy the church. I've seen it happen. And it can be very destructive. And so we need to understand how serious God takes these things, and because we look at this and we're like, well, that was a small little lie. I mean, it really was. I mean, in the scheme of things, it was a small little lie. Okay, yeah, well, this is how much we got for the field, right? Okay, and it's a lot of us look at that and like, oh, that wasn't a big deal, but it is. It's a very serious. And so you imagine when you overlook even the bigger things inside of a church, right? And you don't hold people accountable, and you don't, and you just allow things to happen that shouldn't be happening inside the church amongst the church members, or amongst the leadership. And you see this, what do you I mean? One, what happens internally when the church sees that, but what happens externally, right? What happens when the people outside the church see this, and it's like, well, they're not much different than we are. In fact, sometimes, I mean, and I've seen this. Sometimes, well, they're behaving worse than in their group than I do outside of the church. So why would I want to go in? And so it hurts the testimony of the church, and kills any momentum or any growth potential you have of bringing people into Christ. Because again, I'm not saying we have to be perfect, but when we knowingly and willfully allow things to happen, then that's when we see the destruction come into the church. And so we've got to make sure that we don't allow that kind of stuff, and we stand firm in it. Now, we're not mean or harsh, and obviously we're not going to go around hopefully wishing for people to drop dead, but we have to understand the seriousness of it. Again, you look at this, and it did seem like a very small white lie, but it had the potential of destroying the church. And we've got to make sure that we do not allow anything to come in or anyone to behave in such a way that would do this and to destroy. And we need to make sure we confront it early, head on, and say, hey, this is not going to be allowed. Now, and that's where we need to work. So I hope everyone understands this. I know that sometimes there's a lot of questions around Ananias and Sapphira, and why God was so harsh with them. And I think that hopefully this helps you understand that. But if there's any questions, anyone has any comments or something around it, please let me know. Reach out to us. There's multiple ways you can reach out in the comments and through our website and do stuff like that. But yeah, let me know if you have any questions around that. I hope you learned from it. I hope this was helpful. Man, as always, I really appreciate everyone for watching.